Hello, my name is Quitterie Gounot and I'm a senior at Swarthmore College. Today I'll be presenting a paper called Humean Reason and Desire, Reconciling Moral Cognitivism and Motivational Externalism. I first wrote this paper last spring when I was studying abroad at Oxford University, and so before I begin, I'd like to just thank my tutors at Oxford, especially Paula Boddington, for whom I first wrote this paper, and also my professors here at Swarthmore for their instruction and their continued support. I'd also like to thank David Kaloran at Coastal Carolina University for organizing this conference, and Neil Sinababu from the National University of Singapore for commenting on my paper. In this paper, I take a close look at a very brief but important passage in David Hume's treatise on human nature. In that passage, Hume critiques reason, and he makes a claim that really is at the core of his philosophy of action. Reason is motivationally inert. Reason just can't move us to action. In making that claim, Hume helps us to move forward, to move beyond the motivational internalism championed by Plato and arguably embraced by Aristotle. He encourages us to integrate desire into a functional theory of motivation that is truer to human nature. But Hume wants to go further than that. In this same passage, he also says that moral judgments aren't rooted in reason. And in fact, for Hume, reason has nothing to do with morality at all. In this paper, then, I argue that Hume really is making two importantly distinct claims here. First, a claim about the nature of motivation, motivational externalism, and secondly, a claim about the content of moral judgments, moral non-cognitivism. I argue that it's important to consider these claims separately because I then argue that we can and should accept Hume's claim about motivation, but we can and should reject Hume's claim about the nature of moral judgments. In taking this hybrid, partially Humean position, I take myself to be adopting a position evoked but just as quickly dismissed by the philosopher J.L. Mackie. I agree with Hume that reason is not action guiding, and that means that moral judgments are not action guiding. But Mackie has a worry that if we take such a position, we have to give up the prescriptivity of moral judgments. And I agree with Mackie that that would be a great concession to make, but I don't think I have to make it. Ultimately, I want to draw a distinction between our understanding of an action as good or right and what makes it so on the one hand, and our desire to actually undertake that action on the other hand. I want to put forward a moral picture on which reason and passion, or really belief and desire, both have an important but different role to play in the process that takes us from moral deliberation all the way to action. Before we look at Hume's two claims and how he argues for them, I'd just like to very quickly go back to Plato and Aristotle and trace the roots of motivational internalism there. This will help us to see what Hume was up against and why his insight on motivation is so important. Now, motivational internalism is one of those terms that's been used by a lot of different philosophers in slightly different ways. Just to be clear, by motivational internalism, I just mean the view that motivation is inherent in our moral judgments. In keeping with moral cognitivism, which we'll talk about more later, I understand moral judgments to be, broadly speaking, a certain kind of rational beliefs. Plato is probably the champion of motivational internalism, at least if we consider the moral psychology that he develops in dialogues like the Meno. And I'm aware of the Socrates versus Plato distinction, but I don't think it's a point of particular contention here, so I'll be bracketing that issue and taking Socrates as helping to develop Plato's view. In the Meno, Socrates asks Meno, "Do not all men, my dear sir, desire good?" And in true Socratic fashion, just a moment later, Socrates replies, that the desire of good is common to all. Everyone wants to do the good. And for Socrates, that's just because no one wants to be miserable. So for Plato, it looks like the desire for something is predicated upon the belief that that something is good. Someone might be mistaken as to what is truly good for them, but as we see in other dialogues like the Protagoras, Plato has a very hard time making sense of how someone could know that something is the right thing to do and yet choose not to do it. Also in the Meno, Plato makes it clear that the beliefs he's talking about are based in reason. In order for a moral belief or any belief to rise to the condition of knowledge, it has to not just be true, but also to be tethered by an its logismos, which just means a reason to count or a rational calculation. So for Plato, it seems like moral cognitivism and motivational internalism really go hand in hand. And that's the kind of picture that I want to use Hume to help us break out of. I won't spend much time talking about Aristotle, mainly because I'm just less and less convinced that he's a motivational internalist in any real sense at all. But on a certain very orthodox reading, he does look a lot like one. Aristotle has this concept of the practical syllogism. And just how to interpret the practical syllogism is the source of a lot of debate. But on a fairly orthodox reading, what Aristotle is saying is that engaging in practical reasoning is like completing a certain kind of syllogism. And the major premise of this syllogism is something like a universal set of principles. And the minor premise is the salient particulars of the situation at hand. There's debate as to just what the conclusion of the syllogism is. Some people think it's the action itself. I think it makes more sense to say that the conclusion of the syllogism is the moral judgment that's issued from this reasoning. The conclusion of the syllogism is the best action, the right action or the best action to take in that situation. The action that will provide the best means towards one's ultimate end of achieving the ultimate good of happiness or eudaimonia. We can debate how much room this model leaves for the formation of a desire between the judgment, the moral judgment that something is the right thing to do, and the actual action. But on this very simple interpretation of the syllogism, it looks like motivation is internal to one's moral judgment. It's internal to that belief about what the right thing to do is. Aristotle doesn't really talk about the formation of an intermediate desire and just how that happens and how that moves us to action. Let's go to Hume's passage then in the treatise on human nature. So in this passage, Hume writes, "Morals excite passions and produce or prevent actions. Reason of itself is utterly impotent in this particular. The rules of morality, therefore, are not conclusions of our reason." Let's break that down into a logical argument. Premise 1. Morals excite passions and produce or prevent actions. That's really just word for word the first sentence. Premise 2. Reasons cannot excite passions and produce or prevent actions. Conclusion 1. Reason cannot produce or prevent actions. That's our claim about motivation. And conclusion 2. The rules of morality are not conclusions of our reason. That's our claim about the content of moral judgments. The way I've just broken down the argument, it seems kind of hard to see just how the two conclusions I put forward follow from the two premises I just gave. So we need to read the argument more charitably in the spirit of Hume's text. Let's first look at how we might get to the first conclusion. Reason cannot produce or prevent actions. It seems like what Hume really wants to say here is morals excite passions, reason can't do that. Morals produce or prevent action. Reason can't do that. And really, these two comparisons are related. For Hume, it's precisely because reason can't excite passions that reason can't produce or prevent actions, the way morals presumably can. So let's add a premise 1b, which just says that exciting passions produces or prevents actions. Or if we want to put it in a slightly different way, we might say premise 1b star, actions are produced or prevented if and only if passions are excited. This premise might not be clearly spelled out in this passage, but if we just draw an inference and give Hume the premise that really does seem to be implied in this text, we can get the first conclusion, which is the claim about motivation. Reason cannot produce or prevent actions. So now let's look at the second conclusion, the one about moral judgments. That conclusion is, the rules of morality are not conclusions of our reason. So we've got premise 1a, morals excite passions and produce or prevent actions. Premise 1b, exciting passions produces or prevents actions. Premise 2, reason cannot excite passions and produce or prevent actions. And then our conclusion number 2, the rules of morality are not conclusions of our reason. Well, here's something odd. We start off in the first premise with morals, and then in the conclusion, we end up with the rules of morality. Now, there's no indication that those two things are the same, and it's not clear how we get from one to the other. We know that in a logical argument, we can't just have a term like the rules of morality appear in the conclusion that's nowhere in any of the premises. But again, we want to be charitable, and we want to do our best to make sense of Hume's argument. So let's suppose for now that by morals in the first premise, Hume just means the rules of morality that then show up in his conclusion. Well, that gets us into a bit of an odd situation again. Because if morals mean the rules of morality, and morals excite passions and produce or prevent actions, then that means that the rules of morality excite passions and produce or prevent actions. How does that work? What does it mean for a rule to excite a passion? What does it mean for a rule to produce or prevent actions? We usually tend to think of a rule as a fixed thing that can't engage in any characteristic activity or excite or move anything at all. This argument would be really inconsistent with our ordinary language understanding of the word rule. So maybe Humeans could come back and say that morals for Hume really means patterns of praise and blame of someone's character. But even then, that wouldn't really help us, because if we choose another way to understand morals, we would still have to deal with the fact that we have the rules of morality in our conclusion. So what is going on here? It seems that what Hume is trying to say from the rest of this text is not that morals excite passions, but rather that morals are excited passions. Morals are passions that have been excited. For example, if we take the case of incest, Hume might say that when people say incest is vicious, by which they mean the opposite of virtuous, when they say incest is bad or incest is wrong, they're just expressing their disapproval for that act, which is rooted in disgust. They're not saying anything about any mind-independent properties of the act or any actual characteristics of the act beyond just how it's perceived by people. That's Humean sentimentalism. But can Humeans really make that move and say morals are excited passions? It doesn't seem like it, because going back to our argument and how we got to the first conclusion, we needed the distinction between the passions and the rules of morality, or the passions and what excited them, in order to get our first conclusion, our conclusion about motivation. So if we make these accommodations and say, well, morals are actually excited passions, in order to try and get the second argument, then we really can't draw the first conclusion at all, the one that seemed to follow from Hume's argument, if we just gave him the implied premise in his argument. Trying to make sense of how Hume gets to his claim about moral judgments, then, is really difficult. But the good news is that we can reject that claim and still accept Hume's claim about motivation, his first conclusion. And actually, the distinction we were just talking about between the rules of morality on the one hand and the passions on the other hand illustrates that. It's perfectly consistent for us to say that there are rules of morality that we can formulate and even discover through reason because they have some kind of internal coherence to them. And Hume would disagree with all of that, but it's perfectly consistent for us to say that that's true, but at the same time, these rules of morality have no inherent motivational force to them. Hume's claim of motivational externalism fits in well with contemporary theories about motivation, particularly cognitivist theories, which Hume really foreshadowed. These theories take desire rather than belief as central to motivation. The classic argument for this kind of theory is what's called the direction of fit argument. And the direction of fit argument explains that beliefs and desire don't have the same motivational capacities because they have fundamentally different orientations to the world. They relate to the world in opposite ways. So according to this argument, beliefs are representational. They aim at the truth, and the aim of beliefs is to get the mind to conform to reality. We say that beliefs have a mind-to-world direction of fit. On the other hand, according to the direction of fit argument, desires have a world-to-mind direction of fit. That means that they project an internal conception of how the world should be onto the world. They try to change the world, and it's from that change element that we get their motivational capacity. That's why desires can move us to action and beliefs really can't. This kind of thinking is, again, very much in line with Hume's theory of motivation and helps to illustrate what's at stake here and the fundamental intuition that Hume encapsulates. Hume's passions look a lot like the cognitivist desire in the direction of fit argument. So finally, I just want to address a major objection that anti-Humeans might raise to this hybrid, partially Humean, partially not Humean position that I've proposed. This is J.L. Mackie's objection, which I mentioned at the beginning. Mackie quotes a philosopher named John Harrison, and John Harrison says, "We could say that just seeing that this is right and this is wrong will not tend to make someone do this or refrain from that. He also must want to do whatever is right. That is, we could deny the intrinsic action guidingness of moral judgments." Mackie then argues in reply to Harrison, and I quote, "Harrison's suggestion would save the objectivity of moral distinctions from Hume's attack only by giving up their moral prescriptivity." Mackie then laments how great of a loss it would be to give up moral prescriptivity. And I agree with him that this would be a great concession to make. But I don't think Harrison or I need to make that concession at all. And let's look at why. So I agree with Mackie's argument that moral judgments are normative, and normativity implies prescriptivity. For example, when we say something like, "It's wrong to kill," that's a descriptive statement. But we're also getting at the same moral judgment as when we make the normative statement, "You should not kill," or "You must not kill." Or more immediately, we're getting at the same moral judgment as when we just use the imperative, "Don't kill." These statements are formally different, they're not quite saying the same thing, but they're really just getting at the same moral judgment. So if we agree with Mackie that that's how moral judgments function, and they have this sort of propositional content to them. They can be rewritten as these kinds of statements. Why this fear that somehow if we get off the motivational internalism boat, prescriptivity has to go down with it? That fear is unfounded, and here's an analogy I have to suggest why we shouldn't share Mackey's fear. It's an analogy to a non-moral case in which we actually use the same word, prescription. Let's say that I go to the doctor, and the doctor prescribes me medication. I then come home and decide not to take the medication for whatever reason. You go and you confront the doctor and you say, you prescribed this medication, the patient didn't take it, why? Did you really prescribe the medication? The doctor wouldn't deny prescribing me medication. If pressed for reasons, the doctor might say, I don't know, maybe the patient is lazy or self-indulgent. But whatever the doctor might give as a reason for my not taking the medication would be something about me, not something about the doctor, not something about what the doctor told me or about the prescription the doctor gave me. The doctor's prescription would still stand as a command, not just as a suggestion. We might say that the same kind of thing applies in ethics, that prescriptions are not action guiding in the motivational sense. Perhaps it's better to think of them as action directed. There is a hope, maybe even an expectation, that people will fulfill the very real demands upon them. We might even hope that the fact that something is prescribed might lead to a desire for that thing, which will then move the person to action. But we can't just cut out that intermediate desire from the equation that moves us to action. In conclusion, we can move forward from the Platonic picture and accept this fundamental Humean intuition. The work of motivation is not done by reason. Desires, not beliefs, going back to the direction of fit argument, are what move us to action. At the same time, we can maintain the truth of moral cognitivism and say that moral judgments are these beliefs with propositional content, and we can access and express that content using reason, which is what gives those beliefs that internal coherence that makes them hold together. This position is a combination of motivational externalism on the one hand and moral cognitivism on the other hand. And that position helps us to reconcile two different, but I think equally important intuitions. Lastly, perhaps most importantly, if we move into the direction of applied ethics, it could help us to understand how some people have a belief that something is the right thing to do. Maybe they even have knowledge that that's the right or good or best thing to do. People can know that they should do that thing, and yet sometimes, somehow, they just can't bring themselves to do it. Thank you.